Okay, I think it's running. I wonder where my.
I don't see the red dot.
There's
Oh, I do see
the red dot. All right,
Mike's on.
mic's on. Thanks for reminding me.
Your grandson probably has it.
I don't know.
What does Junior have?
Well, I'm missing my remote control. I don't think it's
Oh,
in
we'll
it.
find Junior. Oh, are we over there today? Anyone else?
Huh? Find a spot.
Find a spot quickly.
All right, wait, what am I doing? Oh, this
We
button.
have extra blankets today.
I think that works. Blankets? Yep. All right, I promised you we're doing the synopsis. Okay, so we have time. We'll get into the next chapter. We did a couple of the verse or the statements in the first chapter or the next chapter, which is chapter 20. Chapter 19, I mentioned to you, if you look at it closely, it's not properly broken. It really, 18 and 19 should have been together. And they are both a narrative and a mixed dialogue. So we went from the dialogues of Christ, where we had them set in the setting. If you remember, the setting was they had the Last Supper on the Essene and proper date, which is interesting, right? And then they went, Jesus said, let's go out into the marketplace. And so they went into the marketplace, probably gathering huge number of disciples, other learners. There was a dialogue in the marketplace. There was a dialogue at the Last Supper, 2 or 3 of them. There was a dialogue in the marketplace. Then they obviously continued on. There was another dialogue that looked like it was near the temple area that is usually considered a prayer, which is interesting too. And then they ended up on the Mount of Olives in the garden. And there is another dialogue there. And then he's captured. Jesus is captured. And then they brought him to Annas and Caiaphas, and then they sent, and when the going got tough, and Jesus accused Annas of his issue, then they sent him to Pilate. So let Pilate sort it out. It's kind of good. Throw him to the officials. And that's where we have him. We had a dialogue with Pilate and a whole thing with Pilate. And then we get 19 and 20 shouldn't have been broken, but they were. This goes into the torture of Christ. And the whole point of this that I think is very clear in John is that Pilate is trying to get rid of Jesus. Not get rid of him like croak him, not get rid of him like crucify him, but get him out. Because I think that Pilate, if you want to, and this is an opinion, but I think Pilate sees this as very dangerous, combustible. In Centurion, I made it very clear that from Pilate's own words, he was concerned about a rebellion of the people. That if he killed Jesus, then he would have a rebellion against the Romans. If he let Jesus live, he saw that as, just another religious dude that had caused problems in Jerusalem. And then remember, he had Barabbas, son of the Father, another Messiah, in his dungeons. And he basically was going to crucify Barabbas, who was, no kidding, a zealot leader and a criminal. And so, a barbaros, worse than a barbaros, a leader of an insurrection. So he was legitimately going to crucify son of the Father. And Jesus is brought, who really, how many insurrections did Jesus lead, right? He was out there with swords. He did take a cat of nine tails, and I thought it was funny, kind of funny in The Chosen. Oh, he didn't hurt anyone. He was just beating the people and the animals out of the temple, but he didn't really hurt anyone or hit anybody. I'm like, you got to be kidding me.
No animals were harmed.
Yeah, there should be a sign, right? No animals were harmed in this, operation or whatever, this movie. To me, that was kind of funny because, everybody wants to make Jesus completely a wimpy, non-masculine, non-godly, whatever. He's kinder and gentler, right? But yet we see in Jesus the strength of God, because John claims over and over and over again that Jesus is God. So if Jesus is God, he's going to follow God's law. And we may not like God's law. Our government doesn't like God's law. Matter of fact, they asked, remember Amy Coney Barrett, one of the things they asked her, which I thought was hilarious, because she kind of wimped about it. But they said, are you going to follow natural law? You know what that means, right? They thought as a Catholic, she might follow God's law. And in God's law, murderers should be executed. Rapists should be executed. Oh my goodness gracious, could you ever do that and really kill people and murder people? Oh, let's not think about that, right? Anyway, I think it's kind of interesting, but Jesus is God. And so they handed him over to Pilate, and Pilate is, like I said, trying to get rid of it. And we're going to see the evidence of that. But here's Pilate. The torture of Christ is that's not part of the Bible. Usually the words, I use directly the words, but I just put it as a top part here, the torture of Christ. So Pilate brought Jesus into the praetorium, and he whipped Jesus with the mastegos while he was strapped to a frame. So literally they put him on a frame. The mastegos is a cat of nine tails with metal pieces. I showed you pictures of it. They whipped him with it. The warriors braided a wreath from thorns, and a wreath is usually given to the victor. Very interesting. Braided a wreath from thorns and imposed on his head. They put around him a reddish purple outer garment, a mason or a cloak that was reddish purple. Remember I told you they couldn't do total purple? Total purple would have been, totally king, and the normal people didn't have that. It would have been illegal in both Greek, Roman, and Hebraic society. But they put on a purplish red. They came forward and they yelled, "Grace to the King of the Judeans," and they slapped him on the face. So slapped him, it says specifically slapped open-handed, which is also interesting because, you'd expect Romans to use brass knuckles and maybe backhand or hit. Part of the reason they did that was they are obviously, slapping to us, it's become like a common thing. I guess everybody slaps everybody on TV, whatever, and even in the awards, the awards thing, right? But slapping in Jewish society is legal, but hitting with a closed fist or backhanding, backhanding is legal for a slave, but not for a regular person. So anyway, it's interesting. They slapped him. Pilate came outside of doors. That I find no cause. And I thought this was interesting. I mentioned this. I find that you may know that I find no cause. In other words, we have an interesting and almost perverse judicial system. Because in our judicial system, the cause doesn't seem to matter. In other words, I have a video, I have total evidence that someone murdered another person, and yet I still take that to a jury trial and say, what is your opinion, right? The cause is what the person did. And then after the jury trial, the judge says, oh, this person was abused, this person was poor, this person was depressed, and therefore, even though they murdered someone else and there's cause, right? They did cause this crime. Therefore, I'm not going to punish them too much, right? Because I feel sorry for them.
Extenuating circumstances.
Extenuating circumstances, which, by the way, makes God vomit, right? Our God vomits when they do that because they're, who said this? Someone really famous said, goodness to the guilty or forbearance to the guilty is crime or is a crime to the victim, right? So when you give grace to those who really do commit vile crimes, you're harming society, you're harming the people, you're harming the victims. It's a crime in itself. And by the way, that's what God says about judges who do that. You know, it's not a happy thing for them. Anyway, he finds no cause. In other words, he finds no guilt, nothing that Jesus did that was wrong, which I think is beautiful saying. You know, we say differently, I don't find him guilty, which is what our judicial system does, which is great. You know, at least gives you a chance, right? Even if you did, even if you're the Menendez brothers who killed your own parents, which makes you sad because you killed your own parents, you still get to live a life of niceness and fed, right? Which is really interesting. Jesus came bearing a wreath and a reddish purple cloth, so he took him out, and Pilate said, "You look." That's Pilate. Pilate said, "You look, the man." So Pilate's point was to show, and by the way they beat Christ, you know, was he long for life, you know, after getting 40 lashes and being tortured the way he was tortured. There are accounts, historical accounts, that many people did never survive the 40 lashes, or the especially the domestic, you know, with a cat of nine tails, they didn't survive it. Anyway, Pilate said, "You look, the man." The chief priests and the under rowers, I left that term in there, the subordinates cried out with loud shrieking, "Crucify." And Pilate said, "You crucify, I find into him no cause." And of course, Pilate, you know, Pilate knows that they can't crucify him, even with his decree, because apparently they had made a law, or they had an agreement. And in Centurion, I write it out that Pilate had made an agreement with the Sanhedrin to basically uphold the Jewish law to a degree, but he wanted to keep the corporal punishment, the punishment to death, and the punishment, generally corporal punishment. Now, we've had the question, how did they allow stoning? Well, I threw a stone, accidentally hit a person, and, you know, how do you prevent, you know, rogue mobs? There's no police forces, and there's really no, you know, really, if you didn't notice that the Old Testament and a large degree the New Testament and the whole of history, there's no polices. It's all self-policing. Cultures and societies self-police themselves. It's interesting that we have a society that is not self-policing, and probably one of the most immoral and illegitimate societies in some ways, because you have whole groups, bodies of people in certain cities that are so out of control that they shoot multiple people. Well, in Wichita, we have a murder every day, literally a murder every day, which you might ask, how can we do that with only about 500,000 people in our, you know, in Wichita area? But drugs, alcohol, lack of policing, it's interesting. So they cried out, Pilate said, "You crucify," which he knew they couldn't do. The Judeans said, "We hold a law that he must die. He made himself an offspring of a God." And this is their main problem with Jesus. He must die because he made himself an offspring of a God. He claimed to be the son of a God. We know it was the son of God, but they didn't accept that. Pilate heard, and he was more afraid. So Pilate brought him back into the praetorium and said, "From where are you?" And Jesus didn't say, we talked about this, it was obvious that, you know, Pilate knew all this information. There's no reason for Jesus even to answer. Pilate knew that. What Pilate wanted, I think, is when he asked him this question, that Jesus would give him some exposition, some logical argument, something that Pilate could grasp a hold of. Because Pilate wanted to get rid of him. Pilate wanted to get rid of this issue. You know, if you remember Socrates, what did Crates tell Socrates to do when Socrates was under the death sentence and was supposed to poison himself? Do you remember what Crates said? Crates said, we will help you escape and go into self-banishment. If you leave, Athens, we'll help you. We'll give you a place. We'll take you away. But that way you don't have to die because we think you are a great person and we think, So basically Pilate, this is the typical thing. In the old world, if you had somebody that you didn't think was really guilty, but the law had, prosecuted them, and by the way, the democracy in Athens, this is why democracies are not good, they voted on, it's a vote. It's like a fair vote, right? He had his words in the Apology of Socrates. The other group had theirs, which was the priests, and they took a vote, and Socrates lost the vote, and therefore he was, they had no set constitutional law or even, probable cause, right? No probable cause, just, hey, this is it. So Pilate wanted to figure out a way that he could get him, could get rid of him. And Pilate says, well, you don't utter words to me. Don't you stare at, I hold authority to let you go or crucify you. And Jesus said, you do not hold authority of me if it was not given to you, it says from above. Through it, a greater missed the mark, a great missed the mark. In other words, those who gave me to you have a greater missed mark. That made Pilate a little happier. Pilate again sought to let him go, but the Judeans were screaming, if you let him go, you don't love Caesar like a shield warrior, which is a very interesting statement from the Judeans themselves. So that caused Pilate to make his decision. So what Pilate did is he sat down on the tessellated mosaic. I love to leave that in there. It's what they call it, the knoll, or Golgotha, not Golgotha, but Golgotha or whatever, the knoll. But it's the tessellated mosaic. And I think that's so cool because you can find the tessellated mosaics around the Roman Empire. And that's where the judicial decrees were made by the leader, by the guy, by Pilate type guys. It was a day of preparation for the Passover. It reminds us of that. It was the 6th period in time. And Pilate says, you look your king. And they screamed, you crucify. Pilate, your king I crucify? That's not a question, a statement. And the chief priest said, we have no king except Caesar. And this is a beautiful telos, because by making this statement, they are making a blasphemy and also a statement that would have been illegal under Jewish law.
How could the priests, how could they have made that statement and the people not just revolt against the priest? I mean, this just is odd to me.
I think it's because, how do you cheat an election? Well, if you keep those who are other people that, should be voting, right, and only bring along your people, then I think that's what happened is the underrowers, the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, they're all there screaming,
So you don't think it was a crowd of people like the common people?
I don't think that I'm in. And plus, you have that issue of the Praetorium, I should have a picture, but the Fortress of Antonia, which is right outside the doors of and the Legion was there, and that was where Pilate and his minions and his guys controlled. So the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders could easily control those going in, and the Romans themselves could control those going in. So whether Pilate may have been wiser. I think it's interesting. The Chosen, they got that guy, that spy dude, right? And he seems to know what's going on. if that spy dude was working with Pilate, right, in really working with Pilate, what do you think he would have said to Pilate? Who should you let in? If you want to let Jesus go, who would you let in?
Other people.
The regular people, right? But I don't think Pilate was not a dummy, but Pilate was slightly disconnected from the Jewish people and the Jewish thing. He didn't speak Jewish. He didn't speak Aramaic, right? He spoke Greek. He spoke Latin. So he was disconnected to a degree from the people. And I think the Sanhedrin and the chief priests colluded to make what they wanted to happen. So you see Pilate trying to get rid of him, and you see the chief priests, and they make this statement, we have no king except Caesar. Well, that's a great political statement, right? But you're right. If the people heard him say that, they might have had an uprising right there, right? But, they've already got issues. They got issues, right? Who's the chief priest? Well, I don't know. You got a bunch of choices, right? We know it was not just Annas and Caiaphas. There were other chief priests. So the chief priests, not just two. How many are there supposed to be? Yeah. And since when, and by the way, is this chief priest in the lineage of Aaron? The last one that we know was in the Maccabees with Jonathan. Jonathan caused issues because Jonathan was the high priest in the lineage of Aaron, but what did he do? He began to Hellenize the priests. And by the way, it's really interesting that he was trying to Hellenize the priests, but he was rejected by the people and rejected also by the leaders. And he ended up, we believe, he was the Essene dude. He's the guy who started the Essenes. How can a Hellenized Jewish high priest be the head of the Essenes? I don't know. Because, right, the head of the Essenes was supposed to, all the Essene literature from the Dead Sea Scrolls is all really high and mighty kind of stuff. And remember, they had made their own temple. They were actually sacrificing animals, sacrificing to Yahweh in their own, what was the famous one? The one that was Messiah, yeah, that's where we believe they were sacrificing animals. And also, there were not Essenes necessarily in Alexandria, but Alexandria, the temple in Alexandria, they were sacrificing illegally, right? So you had Jonathan, who started the Essenes, who was sacrificing animals illegally with the Essenes, who are supposed to be the peak and top of following the judicial law of the Jewish people. So it's just really an interesting situation. And to us, we barely understand the complexities of some of the politics in our own world, right? Who's paying for this? Who's paying for that? Who's inciting this? Who's inciting that? Who's running this? Who's running that? In some cases, we think we really know. In other cases, nobody knows. What's going on sometimes. The astroturfing is astounding. Now, think about the astroturfing that was going on in their world, right? You have these groups of very zealot-like groups. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos is just coming, right? Teen Hodos is just about to come on the scene as a group, an acknowledged group. It's already started by Jesus, but yet we have these other groups that are very zealous and oppositionally zealous. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're buddies, right? No, they have totally different God worldviews, right? Totally different. And by the way, the Pharisees believe in the resurrection of the soul, the body, the full body and the soul, where the Sadducees don't believe in any resurrection at all. You just die or die, right? The Essenes, what do the Essenes believe? We really don't know. We have no idea. We think they may be of kind of a Greek. Remember, Jonathan was Hellenizing the Jewish priests. and he's the guy who took his ball and ran away. So what do you think their worldview is like? Probably a Hellenized Jewish worldview. That's why they kind of taste like Jesus, right? Jesus was following a lot of the Essene ideas, but Jesus, if you want a basis for his viewpoints or the viewpoints that we see, he was very Hellenized in his thing. Now, I think it's a God thing, right? The God thing is we are who we are because Jesus was Greek-speaking Hellenized thinker from God because he was God. Does God speak Greek? Oh, he speaks it all. But Greek is a language that's so concrete that when God says it in a concrete Greek, you go, oh yeah, right? When God says it in the very slippery Hebraic and Aramaic language, we haven't been trained to it, but I'm telling you, talk to your rabbi, baby, some of that stuff is really kind of interesting because it's not as concrete and cohesive as we would like. Some of it is, but what do when we translate it? Thou shalt not murder. How do you get thou shalt not murder from thou shalt not strike? And thou shalt not strike is a huge explanation in the Torah, right? And then the later Bibles say thou shalt not kill, which is really not correct. So, and then there was the one where they had the greatest lack of editing in the history of the world. You know what it is, right? In one of the really early Bibles, Gutenberg Bibles, it says, thou shalt commit adultery. Oh. It was supposed to say, thou shalt not commit adultery, but someone left out the not. And so they tried to destroy all the copies. I think there's 2 of them left, but they're famous copies because they're the greatest misediting ever in the history of writing. Anyway, now computers, you can't mess it up, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. So they said, we have no king but Caesar, and that was the final blow for Pilate. So Pilate gave them over to be crucified. Jesus took the cross piece of the cross. So, he wasn't carrying a whole cross. It's a cross piece. I think it was really interesting. And they went to a place called the Skull, which is Golgotha, which is just outside the city. And they were very specific. They crucified, and with him, one on either side, in the middle was Jesus, which is interesting. And that's a correct thing. I think that's really interesting. They're very specific about that. Pilate wrote an inscription it tells us the next was in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. It says the Nazarene, the king of the Judeans. That's what John calls him. So Jesus from Nazareth, the king of the Jews. The Judeans knew again the spot near the city crucified, written in Aramaic, Latin, Greek. And this is interesting because before, I think the thing that was asked said, well, why didn't the people get mad at them saying, no king except Caesar? Well, this makes a lot of sense that the Judeans knew again. They were reminded of why Jesus was crucified. They were not necessarily at the Praetorium, right, when Pilate made his statement. So the whole of the people didn't know. But because Pilate, isn't this cool? Look, I know we hate Pilate, but I love Pilate. What a guy, right? Pilate is the guy. Because Pilate had put on, they always put an inscription on the cross piece. And we don't know if the inscription went down or went across. Our pictures, our shows are from the Middle Ages and Middle Ages and the whatever period, not medieval period, the Da Vinci's, and that what was it?
Renaissance.
The Renaissance, from the Renaissance, right? It's always a placard right on the top. It may have been a placard, maybe not, whatever. But Pilate had them put it in 3 languages that Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Judeans, which made the Judeans remember or know again why Jesus was crucified, because that was the reason. And the chief priest, I think this is beautiful. The chief priest, this is how you know it's true, right? Because who would record this in history unless this was absolutely correct? The chief priest of Judea said, right now, the king of the Judeans, right, that he said, I am a king of the Judeans. And here's old Pilate. I love this Pilate guy. What I have written, I have written. Don't you just love it? What's that?
Guess what? I get to decide. And you have no say in it.
And you have no say in it. I just, like I said, Pilate has become, in history, he's our villain. But I really do think Pilate was trying his hardest to maintain the law, an even strain, morality, ethics, everything. And yeah, he caved. So we can blame him for caving. But remember, Jesus even gave him an out. Said, the ones who handed me over to you have the greatest sin or missed the mark because of this incident. Anyway, I think it's really interesting. The warriors crucified Christ, so therefore the warriors being the legionnaires, which was to be expected. The other gospels tell them that they were told to crucify Christ as a king, which would have meant they used pegs in his arms rather than just tying him up. They took his outer garments, made 4 shares, the tunic without a seam. We split not it. Let's do a lot to see whose it will be. And they petitioned. And this is graven. This is written. They petitioned my outer garments against my garments. They threw a lot. That's from the Torah or the Tanakh. Mary, the sister of his mother, Mary of Clopas, and Mary the Magdalene, were a crosspiece of the cross, a crosspiece distance from the cross. And Jesus stared at Mary and the disciple he loved like the gods. And Jesus said, woman, you look your offspring. And then you look your mother, to the disciple. And from then on, the disciple hurried into his own, took her into his household. This, we presume, is John, the writer of the gospel, the disciple that Jesus loved like the gods. He's mentioned a few times. We've talked about this. And then it says, Jesus, when all was consummated, as written in the Torah and Tanakh, he said, I thirst. And a sponge full of the vinegar around a hyssop, they bore it up toward his mouth. I told you this is a critical point that means that Jesus died for uncleanliness as well as for your sin. We don't even think about cleanliness, uncleanliness in our worldview, our ideas. But how important is cleanliness to the Jewish people? It is so important. What do you call it? That stuff is kosher. It's got to be kosher, right? The killing's got to be kosher. Everything's got to be kosher. And part of that is today, it's interesting because you can't maintain Jewish cleanliness because there is no temple. So it's impossible to maintain cleanliness or against the sin because they aren't possible. Now, I will mention this, that one of the most important things is in the Torah and the Tanakh and also in the Mishnah, it says specifically there is no sacrifice for intentional sin. The only sacrifice for intentional sin is Jesus Christ. Yeah, this was set up from the beginning by God to be an indicator. So this is why this is so important, because this means we don't have to worry about cleanliness or uncleanness, and we don't have to worry about sin anymore because of Jesus. He drank the vinegar. It has been clean. And if you want to think about this, remember when Jesus, the Last Supper didn't happen like it did with the other Gospels. In the other Gospels, the Last Supper, what did Jesus do? He institutionalized the Thanksgiving sacrifice of bread and wine, right? His body and blood. Look at what happens in the consummation of the cross in John. So Jesus drinks vinegar wine, if you like, and his body is the bread. In other words, he is the sacrifice. And this, if you ever wondered why in John doesn't have the Last Supper with the wine, the wine of Ezekiel, and I think it's Ezekiel, and the bread, the hidden matzah, right? It's right here. It's right here. Jesus drank the vinegar, has been completed, and gave over the conscious breath, his pneuma. The Judeans' preparation for the Shabbat, for the Passover, the physical bodies may not stand on the cross. They asked Pilate if they might rend their legs in pieces, break their legs so they would die. The warriors came and rent in pieces the legs of those crucified together with Jesus, but they found Jesus was already dead, and they did not rend his legs. They didn't break his legs. A warrior pierced his rib with a lance, and out came blood and water. And I told you that proves that he died of crucifixion and that he was dead. You're not going to have blood and water coming out of your lungs if you're not dead. Witness, not false witness, you persuaded. I left that in because John was very particular about this, that John was very particular that he said that there is a witness that to this. So we don't know who that witness is. You could probably guess. Who do you think the witness was to this? I don't think it was John, because John says there was a witness that was.
The one.
How about Joseph of Arimathea? And how about Nicodemus? Because, look, we know that John was answering the question, what else? What else happened? What is not in the other Gospels? What should we know? The other Gospels, and why waste words? They may have known this before. How did Joseph of Arimathea know that Jesus was dead and ready to come off the cross? I think you watched, I think Joseph of Arimathea saw all this happening. He saw it, he knew Pilate, so he probably went in, right? So what do you think the warriors did? The first thing the warriors did, they broke the legs of the other guys, and then they, it's going to be their job to dump them off the cross, right? But they broke the legs of the other guys. Who's going to give them authority to pull them off the cross? Pilate's going to give them authority, right? I don't think they had Gaius Flaccus, the guy who was the questionary, the executioner for the legion, might have, because he may have that authority. He's like the coroner, right? Yeah, they're dead. Pull them off. But Pilate, the Judeans came and asked Pilate, can we break their legs? Pilate sent the warriors. He broke their legs. The big deal is, are they dead? Right? So I think old Joseph of Arimathea was watching all this. What did the warriors do? After they broke the legs, after they pierced Jesus with the lance, they went to Pilate, right? And they told Pilate, they're dead. And Pilate would say, okay, you can pull them off the cross, right? That's the way it works. Because judicial authority, the authority of everything. So he pulled them off, and John tells us there's a witness, a not false witness, that you be persuaded who saw this. And then the graven, a bone they will not be crushed completely, graven they will stare at, they have pricked out, they have pierced. And then it says, Joseph of Arimathea to Pilate. So picture this. this way I would picture it. This is conjecture, but I picture it that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus are watching this. They're watching the whole thing. They realize the whole of what's going on, right? That Jesus is going to be sacrificed for the sins of, they think probably just the Judeans, the Jewish people, but we know it was for all of mankind. And so they know this, and they go with the warriors, and they're with Pilate with the warriors. Obviously, Joseph of Arimathea was able to speak to Pilate. What do you think he said to Pilate?
They're dead.
Well,
Give me the body.
can I take the physical body of Jesus? And right there, Joseph of Arimathea to Pilate. Might lift up the physical body of Jesus. And Pilate turned over. So Pilate gave him that authority. Said, yeah, go ahead. So meanwhile, the legionnaires are going out. Now, the legionnaires, if they were just going out, they would have done the bodies of all of them, right? Pulled them all off the cross, What do you bet? Joseph of Arimathea went. The warriors went, said they're dead. Pilate said, pull them off. Joseph of Arimathea was there, said to Pilate, I want the body of Jesus. Pilate said, okay, you can have it. Says Nicodemus came with myrrh and aloes and 100 pounds. So maybe they had the help of the warriors, of the legionnaires, but they pulled Jesus' body off the cross. They put it down. They prepared it. It says, the body of Jesus, fine linen in company with the spices, the unwritten custom to prepare a body for burial, which I think is really interesting, that John tells us this is an unwritten custom. Did you have a question? So that I think is really interesting. And then where he was crucified, there was a garden, a sepulchral monument where no one had been placed. So it was an uncorrupted grave. I told you before that in the graves, they would put the bodies in. They would allow the bodies to turn to basically to bones, and then they put the bones up and put them in a little casket. What do you call that? Ossuary, yeah. That would help continue the process of defleshing, but it would fit a human body's bones, and they were usually pretty small. And they would put those into the tomb. So they would have these limestone ossuaries, and they would have, the place where the body was placed. This was a new tomb, so there was no corruption in the tomb, which is also important within Jewish context and the context of cleanliness and the context of salvation, right, from sin. The imagery, look, you can't make this up, right? I mean, what's the chances? What's the chances that we think it was Joseph of Arimathea's tomb? That's what we believe in, what do you call it, in not myth, but in tradition. Traditionally, we think that it was Joseph of Arimathea provided a tomb. But what's the chances he would provide a brand new tomb, right? With nothing in it. Yeah.
I've just seen other shows where they go into the tombs. Yeah, they say they may put them into an ossuary, but in the ones I've seen, they just kind of push them to the back and put the new body in, and then later they push the bones to the back. And when they go in and go through those, they see a pile of bones in the back with all of this. So the fact that it was brand new means there wasn't any other bones shoved back there.
New Orleans, right. They have a space in the back.
Well, and if you look at the catacombs, now the question is why? Perfect world, okay? Perfect world. You take a body and you rent the tomb or the body, because these are expensive things, right? So you're a rich dude, you own your own for your family, or it's a family tomb, or what? You borrow, right? A borrowed. Wait, that's just like Jesus, right? A borrowed tomb. Isn't that interesting? But a borrowed, unused tomb. Now, the average person, if, you know, you pitch out the bucks, I don't know what it costs, maybe a couple of denarii, maybe a bunch of denarii, maybe a denarii per year until you're like, anyway, so you rent the tomb and they put you in it. Now, how long does it take to forget about old Uncle Jack who's in that rented tomb? Yeah, oh, you remember Uncle Jack? No, who's that guy? You know?
Humidity, temperature, there's a lot of things that go into how long.
So who's saving money for his ossuary, right? For the thing. Who's got it, right? Who has it? Oh, Grandma Lewis has it. She's got it over here. You know, it's in her house. But then the time comes, right? And it's like, well, where is she? Oh, she's in this other tomb over here. It's like, where is the ossuary? I don't know. Can you find Uncle Jack's ossuary? You want to buy a new one? No, that's 100 denarii. Who's going to pay that much for a, you know? No. So what do? Yeah. And even if Uncle Jack isn't exactly like all bones, he's not done yet. Because you can make money, right? So, you know, if nobody complains, maybe they put it in the paper. You know, it's kind of like the shrinking eagle. You know, you have the notice. Yeah, Uncle Jack's time is up. So, you know, Uncle Jack, we're just going to shovel him to the back. If you want it, you know, you got it. Otherwise, he's going to be part of the pile.
Really? You don't think they burned them?
No, they burn him.
In the Old Testament, they always talk about picking up their bones and moving them back.
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
Yeah. Well, what's really funny about Jacob, you know, coming back from Egypt, it says that the Egyptians prepared him. And, you know, I don't remember going through those words specifically before, but if they prepared him, what did they prepare him like? A mummy, yeah. So they're carrying a mummy, you know. Hey, we're getting the mummy, you know. And they pull your brains out, they pull your stuff out, and you got the Coptic stuff and everything. It's like, you know, this is how they got to this. But, you know, when they got to it, it's like, do you remember how to do this? And they go, no, I don't. You pull the brains out, you do this, eat it. It's like, I don't remember. What do we do? They just wrap them up. Yeah, throw them in. You know, they'll be okay after a while. Ooh, right? And then you get Uncle Jack. So anyway, yeah, you know, this is what happened. And we know, you know, the biggest deal is, I'm sorry, but that's the thing. When you're dead, I don't care how many people loved you, you know, unless you're linen, that you're still kind of soft and, you know, in a glass casket, and you are still rotten a little bit. They have to spray the insecticide on you occasionally. You know, you're not going to be happy after a while. Yes, sir.
That'd be why they use myrrh and aloes and things. It's not to preserve the body. It's to keep it from smelling too bad for people who pass here too.
Yeah, old Lazarus, you know, yeah, he's got his, you know, his old spice, yeah, his old spice, but he stinketh, Lord, right?
100 pounds is a lot of spices.
Yeah, and expensive too, right? Yeah, spices aren't cheap. Yeah, 100 pounds, which is about 75 pounds. It's 100 Roman pounds. They put it off the Roman part. And here it says, yeah, I wrote in custom. And finally, furnished aside preparations, Judeans near is the sepulchral monument they placed Jesus. And so I left this in the Greek, but I shortened it a bit. The point is that in the preparation for the Passover, because it was near, they placed Jesus in that sepulchral monument that was very close. And it happened to be the sepulchral monument that not one was placed. But that was the end of John 19. So at the end of 19, we have Jesus in the sepulchral monument, in the tomb. Presumably, you know, the stone is rolled in front. And so that's it. That's the end. And that is a reasonable break, right? When they broke the chapters, they broke it reasonably.
You think John didn't make a big deal about the tomb being sealed because that was in
And he also, you notice, okay, we can start, we do have a little time, so we can start with 20. I'll have to give you the 20 pieces next time. But early the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. There you go. The stone had been placed, but it was removed now. Yes, sir.
Well, in keeping with that, the others also mentioned that the Jewish leadership went to Pilate and said that they claimed he was going to be resurrected, so they think they may come in and try and steal the body. Can you place guards on it? He didn't mention that either.
And there's, let's see.
And just to add to that, so Joseph went there to ask for the body, but if you take the other books into account, maybe all of the Jewish leadership went there and told him, hey, put guards on it, and then Joseph said, and can I have the body?
That could be. We do get the impression from the other, we get the impression, and we're not looking at the other documents, that it's possible they came late to Jesus. So was it after the Passover, or when exactly did that happen, right? So,
Why wasn't there more of a fight for his body if they were worried about him being there?
well, I don't think they were. Well, the Jewish leaders may have been. And matter of fact, the Jewish leaders, okay, I'm just giving you some conjecture. Let's, and some of this we would really need, and I didn't do this, prepare this, but we really need to look at, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and see what it says specifically about the resurrection and about the specific events, and see if we can tease it out. In Centurion, I think I kind of did that, but the big deal is that I think that the Judean authorities, they were clueless. Their whole thing was, let's crucify Christ. But when they went home for the Passover and they saw, remember the Passover, Passover in Centurion, I made a big deal about it. We know historically that only the first tier got their Passover lamb sacrificed, right? There were 3 tiers: the priests, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and then the common people. So we believe that they started sacrificing late because they legally really couldn't start sacrificing until the sun was up, right? Remember, the sun was down from 12 to 3. So the water clock in the temple said it's time, but it was dark. And you can't sacrifice in darkness. It can't be done. So the presumption is that the high priest did not start sacrificing until 3 o'clock. Well, usually it took from 12 all the way to sundown to sacrifice the 3 tiers, with all the priests and everybody sacrificing, right? So how many do you think they got sacrificed from 3 to about 6 or so, 6 or 7? They didn't. In Centurion, I make the big deal that the common people said there was no Passover sacrifice, but yet those who had followed Jesus, who were accepting Jesus and convinced of Jesus, said there was a Passover. The Passover was Christ. So what do you think the Jewish leadership thought when they heard that? When you have a whole, look, I think that the number of people that were following Jesus was enormous in Jerusalem at that time. I think it was huge. I think it could have been more, but it was at least 1/5 of the city. And you had 1 million people there. You had all these people from all over Judea, right? And all over, where else? The Galilee. I told you, I think that it's obvious that Jesus was the rabbi of Capernaum. What do you think all the people from the Galil are thinking? They come coasting in Jerusalem and they're killing their rabbi, right? What do you think? It's like, it's huge. And so do you think they remembered all of his sermons, all of his talks, all of his things? It's like, I think it was a huge deal. And I think what happened is the Judean leaders went home, had the Passover, and they were all happy and giddy, right? And then what did they hear?
A lot of disgruntled people.
Yeah, the people didn't have their Passover sacrifice, right? And then they heard from them, but we did have a Passover sacrifice. Yes, sir.
In all the Gospels, they have recordings of all the physical things that happened inside the darkness, earthquakes.
Yeah.
I mean, even
People resurrecting from
the priests were freaked out when the temple curtain came
Curtain,
down.
yeah, when it
I mean,
rips,
that's
it's
like,
like, whoa.
things were shaking, the curtain rips, you run out of the building.
Precisely. Matter of fact, that was the other question. I bring that up in Centurion. But the fact that when the temple, the curtain in the Holy of Holies was ripped open, could the sacrifice be considered, could any sacrifice be considered legitimate once the temple, the curtain in the temple had been ripped open? That's a huge theological question. You need a whole Mishnah statement about that, right? That I don't think they ever asked. What's that?
In the event of.
Yeah. Break into, here's the thread and sewing thread, right? Break in the event of the curtain being ripped open by the Holy
In
Spirit.
history, this made me think, was anything ever talked about in the Jewish history then about what they did about that veil?
No, but
Because that's a huge thing.
the earliest documents we have, there may have been other documents that were, but the earliest documents we have about Jesus are about 100 to 200 years later in Mishnah sources. And most of them, very interestingly, try their origination things. So, that he was the son of the son through rape of Mary by one of the Roman legionnaires, not a centurion, not a, optio, not just some random grunt legionnaire, had raped her. And that was the story, right? And the other one that came out was that he was a sorcerer. He was a sorcerer in Egypt who came to Jerusalem and brought his sorcery to Jerusalem. So those were two of the big Mishnah things. I think I've given them to you before, or I've had them, but those were two of the big Mishnah stories that came out. So the most important things to them there were two really important things to them. Number one, that it was obvious that he had been born in a very unusual fashion. His lineage, his bearing came about in a very difficult to prove fashion. So what did they have to do?
They altered the story.
They had to make up a story, right?
Maybe the real story will be found in the bird bag someday.
Yeah. They had to make up a story to explain it. The other big deal was he was a miracle worker, right? He made miracles. That's the point of John, the Simeon, right? The Simeon, so that you might be convinced. And we know that all the Gospels, and not just the Gospels, that the Mishnah talks about the miracles, that he was a sorcerer, right?
You have to try to explain it away because everybody knows it's true.
Bingo. So apparently, and remember, the Council of Jamnia is about 100 AD. So the Council of Jamnia had already met to say all Greek documents are false, are not allowed in Judaism, things. So that's why they dumped some of the apocryphal documents, and also why they dumped, the Septuagint is not considered legal for reading in a synagogue. They intentionally did that so they would get rid of any Greek, right? Because what are all the New Testament documents written in? Greek. So we got to kill the Greek in 100 AD. Well, not much longer 50 to 200 AD, they had continual other problems. What were the other problems? We tried to kill it, but all these Greek-speaking, Greek-reading Jewish people are doing what? Well, they're reading it, right? They're reading the New Testament documents because, number one, they can read it. A lot of them can't read Hebrew, right? And the Hebrew is, remember, dead. There is no Aramaic, written Aramaic. The Hebrew is dead. There's really no written Aramaic. So what do they read? Greek. So everybody's reading Greek. And guess what they read? Septuagint, the New Testament documents, right? It's like, we got to read this stuff. So they're reading this stuff. And what's the question? This Jesus guy claims to be born of a virgin. Oh. And this Jesus guy did all these miracles. Oh. How do we explain it? Well, let's make up. Let's put some mission in here. Let's make it so we explain it. Anyway, we'll continue with 20, the resurrection, which is a really cool stuff, right? Thank you, Father, for your word. I pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray.
Doesn't there have to be written Aramaic? Because it said the sign, Jesus